Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9th, 2023, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Bergman, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection.
I am grateful to be leading this special order to discuss the ongoing efforts to tackle our national debt and the looming debt ceiling crisis. Since my first day in office some 7+ years ago, I have said that one of the single greatest threats to our national security is the federal government's reckless, uncontrolled spending. This is now more obvious than ever. To be clear, it is essential that the United States honors its debts and pays back every single dollar that we have borrowed. However, this cannot come without reforms to fix the unsustainable and dangerous spending habits that threaten our long-term solvency. The Limit, Save, Grow Act, which I am happy to say the House approved only moments ago, is a good faith, middle-of-the-road approach to raising the debt ceiling while reining in, and I repeat, beginning to really rein in unnecessary, wasteful federal spending. Included in the bill are popular provisions which would reclaim billions in unspent COVID funds now that the pandemic is over. It will also defund President Biden's army of 87,000 new IRS agents. It'll strengthen the workforce, lower energy costs, and end the era, again, of reckless spending in Washington, D.C., all while protecting veterans, Social Security, Medicare, and national defense. I am grateful to be joined by several of my colleagues that are here tonight to further discuss this issue, and I urge the administration to come to the table sooner rather than later to address the debt ceiling and begin the necessary reining in of spending. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield to my colleague from California, Mr. LaMalfa, 3 minutes.
Well, I appreciate the time this evening. Thank you to my colleague from Michigan for leading us on this and for being a fighter in the trenches on what we're talking about. Indeed, talking about the nation's debt issues, the necessary measure we have of having to extend the debt limit as the dollars have already been committed. They've already been spent. We have to pay for them. So the Limit, Save, Grow Act is indeed a responsible way to try and turn the tide on what had been much spending over the last few years that has extended our national debt to just unthought of numbers, over $31 trillion. But in this measure that we're speaking of this evening here, really since January, the Democrats and President have tried to claim falsely that Republicans have no plan. We've been talking about a plan the whole time. The difference is they won't want to sit down and talk with us about how to meld their ideas with ours. So this week we released our plan, and today we passed it. As always, the House Republicans have consistently argued for reasonable, responsible debt limit increases coupled with spending reductions in order to move towards eventually balancing this budget. It's absurd that the Democrats now demand unilateral increases to our nation's debt and balk at Republicans for asking for something in a negotiation. Our plan, the Limit, Save, Grow Act of 2023, saves American taxpayers $4.5 trillion over the next decade. We will limit federal spending to fiscal year 2022 levels, which our government operated on just 4 months ago. It does allow for 1% annual growth in federal spending over the next 10 years. So for those that want to spend more, it's still built in, but at a flatter rate, flattening the curve on spending. If we'd been able to hold that for the last 10 years, we'd be really close to a balanced budget. Also included in the bill are important clawbacks for $60 billion in unspent COVID funds. And when people see that these unspent COVID funds are sitting there, then they covet them. You get everybody coming in asking, hey, can we shift these COVID relief funds to some other pet project? And that is not what was intended at the time when we had a crisis. However much of that crisis might have been exacerbated by false information or what have you. But this, indeed, the opportunity to take $60 billion of unspent funds and pull them back and indeed have better conversations in a budget and appropriation process, not an emergency as was COVID, it'd be much better off for all of us. So, as we know, the pandemic is over, this money has not been spent, and it should be rescinded without delay. That's what we did today in this piece of legislation, the Limit, Save, Grow Act. Also included in the bill is our Lower Energy Costs Act, which has already passed its chamber with bipartisan support previously. It lowers energy costs for American families and modernizes our outdated permitting process. House Republicans' plan is economically sound, financially wise, and allows for a debt limit increase of $1.5 trillion to pay our bills. It's a reasonable and responsible plan that will benefit all Americans. This body deliberated on the merits of this legislation, has passed this legislation. The U.S. responsibly did its job on a debt ceiling to pay its already incurred bills. The profligate spending of the past few years cannot become the permanent way of business of this House or of Washington, D.C. We cannot afford even more high-speed debt on bills pretending to be COVID fixes about infrastructure that actually isn't infrastructure, or masquerading as a fix for inflation. It's now on the Democrats in the Senate and the White House to meet with House Republicans at the negotiating table to actually come to a solution. The stall tactics by Senate Leader Schumer and President Biden to run out the clock and do a last-minute crisis debt limit bill with a Christmas tree of goodies that only cause more crushing debt cannot be the way of doing business here. Never before in our nation's history has a debt ceiling been raised without also spending reductions to go along with it. It's a negotiation. So this time should be no different. So we must demand that the Senate come to the table and the White House negotiate. By us getting legislation out of this body here, now the ball's in their corner. It's time for them to look at our document and come up with their ideas and sit down and do as these bodies are supposed to do in front of the American people, not on Zoom, not behind masks, not remotely, but in front of everybody, and make a product that we can all be proud of and at least live with and move towards balance in our budget longer term. This is what House Republicans are trying to do, not all the caterwauling we heard about, oh, it's going to take away from this and that and the poor and every other group you can name here. It doesn't even touch all that. We've already spent the money. We have to have the debt ceiling increase and be responsible in the spending reductions as we go along. So what would be wrong with that? Anyway, I appreciate the effort of my colleagues, our leadership, Speaker McCarthy, to get this thing through and get everybody at the table on our side and hopefully be successful with the Senate and the White House and see the logic of what we're trying to do here. So with that, my colleague, thank you for leading us here, and I'm actually fairly excited and optimistic that we can get this document out.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, when we talk about debt ceiling limits, we are, as my colleague stated, we have already spent the money. Now it's time to pay our bills. And when you think about how that all starts, it starts with responsible spending and allocation of funds on the front end, knowing that there are limits. But you know, when in my first term in the 115th Congress as a member of the Budget Committee, I still remember very starkly a data point that was given to us as new members of the committee. And the subject was improper payments by the federal government. And 7 years ago, that number was $150 billion a year in improper payments by the federal government. So when we talk about limiting debt and we talk about clawing back funds that have already been appropriated and are sitting in accounts, we always have to consider the fact that are we as the federal government really managing the expenditure of the dollars? And if, because of the fact that there is no incentive within federal bureaucracies to attack improper spending, we haven't addressed the entire problem. So when you think about an example of what that $150 billion annually would mean in improper payments, think about an example would be if a person who, God rest their soul, has deceased, but yet their Social Security check still comes, or other checks come. You know, there is an end game for that, but another example would be that a person is receiving a check for $1,000 that really should be for $100. That's just error. So we need to look inside ourselves, within the bureaucracies, within the federal government, to cut down the improper payments, because we have to look at the debt control, if you will, and the debt reduction, or as you've heard other people say, bending the curve down to a reasonable rate of repaying our debts without increasing the debt and increasing the unnecessary wasteful expenditures. We have to figure out a way to incentivize the good, hard-working folks within our government bureaucracies to take a closer look at all those things and be part of solutions that are going to benefit our country as a whole and all of its citizens. So I would like to conclude by just saying we got a great start here about 30 minutes ago when we passed the Limit, Save, Grow Act. And this is just the next first step towards hopefully fruitful, honest, thoughtful negotiations with the White House to make us begin to be able to bend that curve of wasteful spending. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the rest of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9th, 2023, the chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Santos, for 30 minutes.